Shalom, amigos amigas, and welcome to Tom Rhodes Radio Smart Camp. Hooray and hallelujah. Hooray for humanity. I want to dedicate today's episode. I've been wanting to do an episode about Seneca for a very long time, and I want to dedicate today's episode to Sam Coleman, my buddy who lives in Sweden. I actually just Skyped with Sam today. We hadn't spoken in a long time, and I told him I was going to do an episode on Seneca. Sam, you may remember, he's from San Diego. He lived in Amsterdam when I lived in Amsterdam, and he was pretty much the best friend that I made while I lived in Amsterdam. And years ago, in that period, when I was living in Amsterdam, I was trying to do I was filming everything, and I was filming interviews with people about happiness and what made them happy. And I had come up with this 30 questionnaire thing that I would ask everyone. And I tried to do people of all different ages and ethnicities and sexual orientations. It was my study on happiness. And at the end of the interview, the last question was, what advice would you give people? What's the biggest key or secret to happiness you could advise people? And my friend Sam Coleman said, read Seneca. And I had never read Seneca before. And because of my friend Sam, I read Letters from a Stoic, which I think everybody should read. I'll read you my highlights from that later. And then Seneca Dialogues and Letters. Those are the two books that I read after Sam Coleman told me that. And of course, I've just been happy every day since I read Seneca. Not really, but Seneca... Well, first of all, before we start, I want to say a few things. Number one, to my Patreon Golden Buddhas, the people that give the maximum amount of money to support the podcast. For April, instead of sending out postcards like I normally do, I sent everybody a package. I cleaned out my mom's attic in Florida a couple months ago. And so it took me a few stages of being home to sort out all the scripts from my sitcom. I sent everybody who's a Golden Buddha a script from my sitcom, blueprints from the set designs. I ran out of the scripts. There was only one person, William in Connecticut. Hey, William. He just signed up to be a Golden Buddha last month, and I had run out of scripts. So sorry, William, you're the only Golden Buddha who didn't get a script. But I did send every album I've ever made, the digital downloads of the new albums, and all of these Tom Rhodes career artifacts should be arriving in your mailboxes very soon. So I've sent a package to all of my Golden Buddhas, and I think it will bring you joy. Let me have a sip of my spiced chai tea. And I want to tell you a story real quick about a very unfortunate story that happened to me last week in Las Vegas. Hey, let me preface this by, some guy sent me an email, beautiful email last week, and he was saying how I remind him to be optimistic, and then I also remind him to be a classy person and deal with people with respect when he's operating in the world and he gets irritated by people and things. And I thought that was a really beautiful thing for the guy to say, that I'm his guiding light when he's irritable in public. He tries to remember how I would operate. And that's really a beautiful sentiment, because I don't always live up to my ideals, and that's pretty much the life of Seneca. Seneca wrote beautiful things, advice. He kind of invented the essay, or all of the greatest essayists through human history were inspired by him. He wrote about how to live, how to avoid anger. He's the quintessential Stoic. He articulated the philosophy of Stoicism better than anybody. But so it's interesting that guy sent me that email about, that I remind him to be a good person in the world. I had a really unfortunate story happen to me last week. I was at the Laugh Factory in Las Vegas, and there's 2 shows a night. So I've got like 45 minutes between shows, and I normally pop up to my room and, use my bathroom, check emails, whatever. If I'm watching BBC documentaries, I'll watch 30 minutes of it. It's a little ritual that I run back to the room. So on the second show, I come back, and in the dressing room at the Laugh Factory, it's kind of like a clubhouse for comedians. A lot of comedians stop by who aren't working there, which I love because comedians are my tribe, and I love comedians. So normally, it's a good way to operate in the world. So I come into the dressing room, and the second show had just started, and the comedian I'm working with is talking to a comedian who's not on the show. Let me emphasize that. This guy is not on the show. He just popped into the dressing room for, I don't know, to say hi, to drink free beer. I don't know. So when I walk into the dressing room, this guy who I don't know, who's not on the show, he's telling some story about some comedian in Texas who had stolen his material. And then that comedian who stole his material had to change his name. And then I walk in and introduce, introductions are made, and I recognized the guy's face. I said, "Oh, yeah, hey, man, I know you." And the guy said, "Yeah, we worked together once at Brad Garrett's at the MGM." I was, "Hey, man, good to see you." And then I go over to the drinks station, and I pour myself a Perrier, and then I come over and sit at the table where these 2 comedians are talking, and this guy's story is still going on about this comedian in Texas who stole his material. And the comedian had to change his name. So the guy had repeated some of the details. So I said, "Is there a point to this story?" And the guy spins his head to me and he goes, "Do you have a problem with me?" I said, "No, it's a very long story. And now that you repeated a couple of the details, I was hoping we could get to the end a little faster." Okay, granted, that was probably an asshole thing to say, or a smart-ass thing to say. But I know I've seen comedians say a lot shittier things to people, and this guy went from 0 to psycho in 2 seconds on me. And I mean, okay, it was a smart-ass remark, but he goes, "You know what, Rhodes, you ain't shit." This is in my dressing room before I'm about to go on. I'm going on stage in like 20 minutes. He said, "You ain't the headliner. You're just the last comedian on the bill," which actually I was getting paid more than everyone else, and my photo was on billboards all over Las Vegas. So actually, I was the headliner. I don't know what crappy gigs this guy does where no one's a headliner. So what was the next thing? And so he goes, you're the last comedian on the bill. And I said, "Hey, brother, that's a lot of negative energy in my dressing room." And he goes, "This ain't your dressing room. This is the comedian's dressing room." This guy's all pissed off, and I got psycho older brothers. I know the look in a man's eyes when he's ready to fight. And this guy is blazing fury in his eyeballs. And I said, "Hey, man, I'm going to go ask George to remove you from the dressing room." George is the manager. And I don't know if the guy thought that I was joking or what, but I went and got George, and I said, "Hey, man, this guy's being a little hostile in the dressing room, and he's not on the show." So George comes back, gets him, asks him to get up and leave, and he's like, "Really? Really?" He goes, "Fuck you, Rhodes. I'm going to be outside waiting for you." The guy just threatened me in front of the manager. Like this is high school, and I have to fear for my life. He's going to be outside waiting for me. And I said, "Hey, man, I didn't come here to fight. I came here to do comedy." And as he's going out the door, he says, "You know what? You're a fucking pussy." And I said, "Pussies have long memories." And that's basically where I wanted to start this episode about Seneca, because first of all, what's wrong with being a pussy? I don't know why that gets such a bad rap. in our society. Being a pussy is how I made it to 52 years old, ladies and gentlemen. And and I didn't come there to fight. I came there to do comedy. And like I said, comedians are my tribe. And like I was all jacked up on adrenaline. Fortunately, I used that and put it into my second show, and I had a great show. But then there's this fear that I'm gonna have to fight this guy afterwards, and you think, okay, that story's finished. He was having a bad day. I heard that the guy's getting divorced, but I'm getting divorced. I'm not challenging my comedy brothers and sisters to fights. So, you can give someone the benefit of the doubt and think, hey man, that guy was just having a bad day. He doesn't have my phone number. The next day I wake up at noon, and at 12:12, he texts me, I can't, you're a coward for going to get George to save you, and I can't wait to run into you again, you fucking pussy. And I texted the guy back, now you're threatening me? And he said, be a man, not a little bitch. And I texted him, I didn't come here to fight. I came here to do comedy. Good luck with all of your future endeavors. So this guy threatened me in front of George, and then the manager, and then he threatens me on a text, which I have proof of both. And that's the thing, man. Pussy, little bitch, faggot. Those are words that provoke men into fighting. But what that guy doesn't understand is my bully older brother John called me a pussy and a little bitch and a faggot so many times in my life. Those words have absolutely no meaning to me whatsoever. And I was actually really glad that I remained calm through this thing. I didn't get all, I didn't get too worked up. I mean, yes, my adrenaline was pumping when you're, faced with a rabid dog. But I kind of kept my cool. And I think that story is a really great place to start the Seneca episode, because what I'm trying to express to you is today we're going to celebrate the life of Seneca. And Seneca, as influential as he was on world culture, he was a pussy, and he was a little bitch, and he was a coward. But his writings have endured the test of time. So Seneca was in the ancient Roman Empire. He came from the provinces of Spain. And his family was they were of status. They were an equestrian family, so they were in charge of the horses. So they come to Rome when Seneca's a teenager. He's studying philosophy and debate and all those things that were all the rage in ancient Rome. And then under the rule of Caligula, we all know crazy-ass Caligula, he kind of overstepped his bounds with his words, and Caligula was going to have him killed. But a female friend of Caligula's told Caligula, Seneca has got tuberculosis or some disease and he's going to be dead soon. So that's the only reason that crazy-ass Caligula didn't kill him. So then Claudius becomes emperor after Caligula, and everybody thought he was a dimwit. And one of my favorite BBC specials is that I, Claudius 10-part series. It was done 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Brilliant acting. Claudius has Seneca exiled to the island of Sardinia. And it was kind of a luxurious exile because he still got to bring his slaves with him. He was living in nice villas. He had lots of fruit, and nuts, and hummingbirds. But he wrote about the agonizing exile and being far away. So after Claudius, the Emperor Nero came into power, and Nero's mother was this woman named Agrippina, and she's the one that got Nero to be the emperor, because it was Nero's half-brother, Britannicus, was the rightful blood heir, but he was too young. He was just a child. So Agrippina positioned Nero to take the throne when Claudius was dead. So she calls Seneca back from Sardinia, to be Nero's tutor, to teach him how to give speeches and debate and be philosophical and act and all of these things. So Nero was a madman in his own right, and Seneca had to, he got rich from Nero, but he also had to navigate the treacherous waters of not getting on the emperor's bad side, where they would, cut your hands off and nail them to the Senate doors like they did with Cicero. But Seneca's writings, his most famous thing is his Letters from a Stoic, which, this is the basis of not only essays, but modern psychology and self-help. And it was this constant self-analysis. And even though Seneca couldn't live up to his writings and his advice, it's some of the most, you've heard me quote before. One of my favorite Seneca quotes is, drinking alcohol is self-induced insanity. He had very smart aphorisms and pithy witticisms and capricious witticisms. So I'm packed up. I'm ready to go to London. I've been wanting to do the Seneca thing for a while. His death, a lot of Seneca, he talked about like facing death, like calmly, remaining calm during anger and disputes. But his big thing was how to remain calm in death, and to face it, just not panic over it. So Seneca's hero was Socrates, and Socrates was ordered to commit suicide, and Socrates' followers were all around him and writing his last words and everything. So Seneca kind of envisioned that kind of suicide death for himself when Nero ended up sentencing him to commit suicide. And it was a terrible death. He slit his wrists and it didn't work. He drank a hemlock, a poison. It didn't work. He had to lie in a steam bath and suffocate himself before he finally died. But before he had died, he had thought about his death for so many years. He had published his thoughts on death and his death last words speech. And one of his best friend's followers was a guy named Tacitus. And Seneca says to him as he's dying, he says, "Aren't you going to record my last words?" And Tacitus said, well, considering that you've already published your death speech, you've already said everything that needed to be said. And if you make such a big deal out of this, it won't reflect kindly on you for posterity if you were such a little bitch leaving this life. So, all right. I just finished reading this book, and it's a biography on the life of Seneca. It's called The Greatest Empire, and it's by Emily Wilson. So let me just read you some quotes. Boo-doop, boop-doop. How are you, wherever you're at? I hope you're dealing with adversity with humor and charm. The story of Seneca's life raises a broader, indeed universal question, which has particular resonance in our time. What counts as success? This is an issue that runs through all Seneca's literary output. He constantly stages conflicts between different models of the good or successful life. He rose from a provincial background and suffered exile and disgrace. But in middle age, Seneca found himself suddenly one of the most powerful men in Rome, and eventually right-hand advisor to the emperor himself. That's Nero. He felt increasingly trapped, alienated, and terrified by his position. After begging in vain to be allowed to retire, he gave back some of the wealth Nero had given him and withdrew from court in 64 CE. But retirement was not enough to save him. His condemnation on the charge of conspiracy represents the emperor's final word against his teacher, counselor, and one-time friend. Yeah, Seneca basically raised him and taught him how to be a man and an emperor. But also Agrippina got her son the position. Nero ends up having her killed also. We'll come to that in a minute. Seneca, really exciting shit. Seneca was deeply engaged in the philosophy of Stoicism and knew that an ideal Stoic, wise person ought to be free, tranquil, and happy at all times, even while dying, even in agony, even in the depths of grief, humiliation, or loss. But Seneca was also, as we shall see, highly conscious of his own distance from the Stoic ideal. I want to skip back. There was a couple things in the very ending. Like I said, he had inspired all these essayists like Montaigne, Diderot, who I've mentioned to you before. Diderot said, "The world will not be free until the last king is strangled to death with the entrails of the last priest." So Diderot's positive attitude towards Seneca aroused a great deal of controversy in France. Fuck, come back to that later. Yeah, all right, fuck it. Let's just keep talking about Seneca. Seneca's awareness of his own imperfection is perhaps the most likable aspect of this endlessly fascinating character. So that's a reason to like him, was that he was an absolute failure at living up to his ideals. So he was a flawed man. Seneca insists that those who attempt to conquer the world and attain political, military, and economic power are far inferior to those who manage to achieve the empire of control over themselves. And that's what this book is called. The greatest empire is to be emperor of oneself. The greatest kind of power is self-control. Seneca's intellectual activities as a writer and philosopher allowed him to grasp towards an alternative to the life of politics and ambition, creating his own distinct model of what real power should look like, an empire inside his own head. The greatest empire is to be the emperor of oneself. I like it. Seneca's intense awareness of, for example, the emptiness of luxury was not independent of his own experiences in luxurious living. Rather, he knew of what he wrote. He understood firsthand that wealth cannot buy peace of mind. If he had not been so rich, he would have been less conscious both of the dangers and the advantages of having money. He was neither a monster nor a saint. He was a talented, ambitious, deeply thoughtful man who struggled to create an uneasy compromise between his ideals and the powers that were and who mediated constantly on how to balance his goals and his realities. His work is deeply preoccupied with the question of how to create and fully inhabit an authentic self, and of what it might mean to be authentic. This is one of many ways in which his work seems particularly relevant to contemporary anxieties and concerns. And that's why we still value Seneca and thoughts on Stoicism. Stoicism, the intellectual movement with which Seneca most closely associated, was designed to create a possibility of individual happiness in times of vast social unrest. The ideal person in Stoic theory is the wise man, who is able fully to realize the truth that nothing except virtue really matters. He thus becomes fully aligned with the real nature of the universe. That's me turning pages. The inhabitants of the early empire were, like ourselves, struggling to come to terms with huge political, cultural, and economic changes. Rome had emerged from a series of devastating civil wars and transitioned uneasily from a republic to an empire under the rule of one man, with the help of the army. Through Rome's extraordinary military success, the world had quickly become more centralized. The gap between rich and poor was vast, and the elite class had gained wealth undreamed of by their ancestors. including an array of luxury products imported from distant reaches of the empire. But the upper-class men had, at the same time, lost much of the political power they had under the Republic, and had lost much of their sense of security and identity. The display of wealth was used as an inadequate substitute for self-respect. Seneca's work is brilliantly articulate about the psychological pressures created by consumerism. Being poor is not having too little, he declares. It is wanting more. Seneca. Seneca followed the standard Stoic line instead, which was that love between the sexes was not a source of delusion and frustration, but rather a natural and spiritual necessity, which should be founded on reason, not passion. Epicurus says that the wise man rarely gets married, because marriage is accompanied by many inconveniences. Although riches and honor and physical health are named indifferent things by our school, and are neither good nor bad, nevertheless we can compromise with what you might call a middle position. By how these things are used and how they turn out, they become either good or bad. So too with wives. We are on the cusp of either good or bad things. But a wise man must think hard about whether he's about to marry a good or bad woman. What do you know? In 41 CE, Caligula was so unpopular for obvious reasons, was assassinated in a plot that involved several members of the Senate. He had no male heir. And the Praetorian Guard, the group of bodyguard soldiers who protected the imperial palace, insisted that Claudius should be appointed the next emperor. The Senate reluctantly agreed. Claudius was descended from the Julio-Claudian family, the grandson of Octavia, sister of the Emperor Augustus. He thus had a fairly good claim to the throne in terms of birth, but he had a limp and a stutter and was generally considered to be a half-wit, so he had rarely been seen as a viable candidate. It is in the context that we should view one of the earliest actions of his reign. This is Claudius. And I'm sorry, it wasn't Sardinia, it was Corsica, where Seneca was exiled. One of the first things Claudius does is banish Seneca to exile on the island of Corsica. Seneca had developed a powerful literary and political voice and had built up powerful connections, most notably a close friendship with Caligula's sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, who were still important figures in court when Claudius came to power. Claudius had good reason to fear that Seneca might be a ringleader in a plot against his life. The accusations were apparently brought at the behest of Claudius's wife, Messalina, although it seems perfectly possible that the emperor deflected responsibility onto his wife. If it had been Claudius's idea to exile Seneca, he would surely have blamed Messalina. In any case, the story goes that Messalina accused Seneca of adultery with Julia Livilla, youngest sister of Caligula, and therefore also Claudius's niece. Julia Livilla herself had only just been recalled by Claudius from previous relegation, along with Agrippina. They had been accused of trying to overthrow Caligula. Seneca himself gives a vague but suggestive account of his own trial and condemnation. I risked my life for loyalty. No word was forced out of me that I couldn't speak in good conscience. I feared everything for my friends, but nothing for myself, except that I might not be a good enough friend. I wept no womanly tears. I did not kneel down low and grasp anybody's hands to beg my life. I did nothing undignified, nothing unbefitting a good person or a man. I rose above the dangers that faced me, ready to attack those that threatened me. And I thanked fortune that she had wanted to test how highly I valued loyalty. Why, if Providence, God, rules the world, it still happens that many bad things happen to good men? Seneca's answer is that God is like a good, strict father, similar to Seneca's own father, rather than like an indulgent mother. God makes us stronger by testing us. For this reason, no bad thing can ever happen to a good man. Every apparent misfortune is an opportunity to be tested, to become stronger, and to know oneself better. Nobody learns what he can do except by trying. A good man may be exiled, reduced to poverty, and have his wife or children die. All events that Seneca suffered. But that good man can be called miserable, but can never be so. The real danger to a person's happiness comes not from danger and adversity, but from excesses of luxury. A man who has always had glazed windows to protect him from the draft, whose feet have been kept warm by hot compresses, which are regularly changed, whose dining halls are warmed by hot air under the floors and moving round the walls, that man will be in danger if he's brushed by a gentle breeze. The person who suffers the assaults of fortune, including exile and loneliness, can comfort himself with the thought that he is never really away from the center and never really alone, while he can conform his will with that of the universe. It is a great comfort to be swept away along with the whole world. Offering a rare glimpse of his actual physical appearance, he insists that he cannot be hurt even by mockery of the baldness of my head, the weakness of my eyes, the thinness of my legs and my height. Where's the insult in hearing what is obvious? Seneca was obviously not a physically impressive specimen, but he manages to turn even that to his own rhetorical, literary, and philosophical advantage. Seneca's metaphors in his discussion of anger constantly come back to medicine. Being angry is incompatible with human happiness. And that's why I told the story at the beginning. Being angry is incompatible with human happiness and is therefore like a sickness to be cured by philosophy. If we are healthy in moral and psychological ways, we will be happy. Being joyful is the distinctive and natural characteristic of virtue. Conversely, the wise person will not be enraged when he sees other people behaving idiotically. If he started being angry every time he saw other people behaving badly, it would never end. So the wise person sees himself as a doctor, surrounded by the sick. He feels pity and a desire to cure their disease, but he is never angry because he knows he is never injured by their behavior. Can you hear me turning the pages? Yeah. Nero expelled Agrippina from the palace, stripped her of her honors and powers, and took away her personal bodyguards. He even supposedly threatened to follow the example of Tiberius and abdicate to live out his life on the island of Rhodes, which would have left Agrippina entirely powerless. Living out your life on the island of Rhodes. Sounds like a plan. As Nero began to slip out of control of his mother, Agrippina took things badly. She spoke out against both Seneca and Burrus. Burrus was a military, those were Nero's main advisors, Seneca and Burrus. And Burrus was a military guy. She spoke out against both Seneca and Burrus, dubbing them the cripple and the exile. One, Burrus, having a maimed arm, and the other, Seneca, a rhetoric teacher's tongue, But she also fought back against Nero and his new supporters, beginning to favor Britannicus as the true heir to the throne. Britannicus was about to reach the age of maturity or manhood at 15. All of a sudden, unsurprisingly, Britannicus dropped dead. It was February 12th, 55 CE, immediately before his 15th birthday, when he would have become the obvious heir to the throne. The official story was that he died of an epileptic fit, but the universal opinion of the ancient sources is that Nero had him poisoned. He hired a woman called Locusta, a poison specialist, who put some toxic substance in a pitcher of water. Britannicus, being wary of poison, had his wine tasted, but it had been made too hot. He then added water to cool the mix, drank it without the taster check it again, and immediately had a fatal seizure. Soon after the murder, Nero ousted his mother from the palace, claiming she had been plotting against his wife, Octavia. Now the young prince had dispensed of his only real competitor, and had also freed himself from the clutches of his mother. In the future, he could act as badly as he had wished. A common sentiment is that a ruler's power inevitably comes at the cost of being hated. A man who fears to be hated doesn't really want to rule. Nero was apparently pleased with Seneca's work as a major spokesman for the ideology of his regime. He rewarded him lavishly with gifts of money, villas, and other kinds of wealth. Tacitus comments that after the elimination of Britannicus, Nero loaded his best friends with gifts, presumably referring primarily to Seneca, especially since he goes on to remark that there were accusers who objected to the fact that men who claimed to be so self-restrained were actually, at such a time, profiting by dividing up townhouses and country houses and loot like that. Ulysses and Trojan women, the clever strategist who is willing to say or do anything to please the king, win the war, and go home loaded with trophies and wealth, begins to look rather like his creator, Seneca. Okay, I guess that was a play that Seneca had written. Then why do you talk so much more bravely than you live? Why do you repress your words in front of a high-up person? Why do you think of money as a personal necessity? Why do you get upset when you lose things? Why do you cry when you hear about the death of your wife or your friend? Why do you think about your reputation? And why are you affected by gossip? Why do you have more land in your estate than the needs of nature require? Why do your dinners not correspond to your teaching? Why do you have polished furniture? Why do you drink wine older than you are? Why this pretentious birdhouse? Why do you plant trees that give nothing but shade? Why does your wife wear earrings that cost as much as a fancy house? Why is your retinue of slave footmen adorned in such expensive outfits? Why is it an art form to be a waiter at your table, and the silver isn't just put down any old way? There's enormous skill involved in laying it out and serving the meal, and there has to be a special professional carver for the meat. Sounds like a nice party. In poverty, there is only one kind of virtue, not to be oppressed or crushed by it. But in wealth, there is a wide field of opportunity for being moderate, for being generous, for being hardworking, for being orderly, and for greatness. He continues, the wise man would not despise himself, even if he were a midget, but he would rather be tall. Okay, well, I guess they weren't using the terminology little person back then. Seneca insists that there is a right way and a wrong way for a philosopher to be rich. There are three central elements in being rich in the right way. One key factor, as we have seen, is that the wise man will not be dependent on his wealth for happiness. He should be able, like the addressee of Kipling's poem, If, to meet both fortune and disaster, and to treat those two impostors just the same. The second major criterion is that the philosophical rich person must acquire his wealth honestly, without taking it illegitimately from anybody else. Wealth must not be stained with somebody else's blood. It is not at all clear that Seneca's own wealth would pass this test. He clearly became wealthy in the service of Nero, as well as through usury that caused suffering in the provinces. And he was at least complicit, if not actually actively responsible, for some of the bloodshed of the regime, including the murder of Britannicus. It is noteworthy that Seneca writes only in the third person about the importance of acquiring wealth honestly. He does not say, "My wealth is taken from nobody else, nor tainted with blood," but rather, "The philosopher's wealth will not be stained with another person's blood." So, he knew he was not a, he didn't practice what he preached. In terms of Seneca's everyday life, being wealthy and influential created a whole set of daily social interactions. Seneca was a patron to many lesser people, and felt the thrill that came from seeing so many others dependent on him and eager to solicit his favor. A man's dignity was directly correlated to the number of clients he accrued. His day began with a great crowd of morning callers, men who would show up at his house and compete for his attention, petitioning for favors, gifts, money, and recognition. Even once he left the house, he would be followed by a trail of his clients. Later in the day, he was expected to entertain them at lavish dinner parties. Those 500 ivory-legged tables had a lot of use. He had a lot of ivory-legged tables, if you didn't guess that. Clients were people who were officially and legally under the rich man's patronage. He took care of them financially and politically, and in return they would show deference to him, visit him and follow him around, promote him if he tried for any public office, and generally contribute to his popularity, honor, and safety. The emperor's romantic life became even more complicated when he fell in love with a noblewoman called Poppaea Sabina, and wanted not only to seduce her, but to marry her. Poppaea was the wife of Nero's party-loving friend, Otho, who would later briefly seize control of the empire. Various versions of the story circulate in the ancient sources. Dio tells us that Nero arranged the marriage of Otho and Poppaea in order to have ready access to her. In any case, Nero hoped to divorce Octavia and marry Poppaea. All that stood in his way was Agrippina's disapproval. She did not want her son to divorce the wife she had chosen for him. Nero was presumably motivated not only by desire for Poppaea, but also by a desire to be rid of his mother's power and influence once and for all. On the recommendation of a freedman called Anacetus, his childhood tutor in the days before Seneca took over, Nero decided on the elaborate scheme of putting Agrippina in a boat out at sea that would be prefabricated to fall apart in the water. He invited her for a pleasure trip in this doomed boat. Agrippina was not stupid and was quite well aware that she was not in her son's good graces. But she may have found it hard to believe at first that her own child wanted to kill her. Moreover, to betray her suspicions would have given Nero further ammunition against her. So, despite being wary of a trick, she came and embarked in the boat. But the plot failed. The boat did not disintegrate as planned, and Agrippina escaped with only slight injuries. However, after the fiasco, Agrippina was all too well aware that her son was trying to kill her. At that stage, Nero knew that he needed more help in following through with his plan. He turned, of course, to his closest and most reliable advisors, Seneca and Burrus, who may already have known about the plot. He summoned them and told them what he hoped to do. We are told that they were at first silent, as Tacitus notes. It was not clear whether they were shocked or just taking time to strategize, as if they might already have known his intentions all along. Then, we are told, Seneca took the initiative. He looked at Burrus and asked if the military should be ordered to carry out the killing. They did so, and Agrippina, in her bedroom, was pounced upon by a mob of soldiers. She knew, of course, that they had come from her son. She told them as they began to club and cut her to death, "Strike here," pointing to the womb from whence Nero came. In Dio's account, Agrippina had always suspected it might come to this. In scheming for her son's rise to power, she declared, "Let him kill me as long as he rules." Exciting. Who would kill their mommy? What a creep. Nero was not to be restrained from his desire to sing and dance and act on stage. He was a showman. And it seems very likely that Seneca ever hoped he could be. And it seemed very unlikely that Seneca ever hoped he could be. It has been well noted that Nero not only acted himself, but forced all those around him to become actors in the audience, playing the part of a good, appreciative spectator. Theatricality was the dominant mode of the age. The spectacular entertainments available to the Roman public included not only chariot racing, theater, athletic displays, but also, of course, gladiator fights in the Colosseum, in which men, usually prisoners of war or condemned criminals, were forced to fight to the death, either against each other or against exotic wild animals, lions, elephants, bulls, tigers, or both. The games were hugely popular and had their own theatrical conventions, costumes, and props. The man with the net was known as the reticulator, and the man with the sword was the gladiator. Seneca has often been celebrated as one of the most humane voices from this most inhumane of historical periods in his hostility to gladiator fighting. He certainly does provide vivid and articulate accounts of how brutally cruel the practice was. In the mornings, Roman gladiatorial shows were usually carefully scripted theatrical performances involving elaborate costumes, props, and weapons for the fighters and expensive wild animals to attack the humans. But during the lunch break, spectators were treated to a show that involved far less trouble for the organizers. Condemned criminals were simply pushed into the arena and forced to kill one another. It is against this practice that Seneca's greatest ire is aroused. These are the words of Seneca. In the morning they throw the men to the lions and bears. At lunchtime to the spectators. The audience demands that each person who is killed should face the one who will kill him in his turn. They keep the victor for another slaughter. The end of every fight is death. It's enacted by sword and by fire. This happens when the arena is empty. You may say, "He's a robber. He killed somebody." And so, what follows? He deserves to suffer this punishment for his crime. But you, poor man, what did you do that you deserve to watch it? Why does he show so little empathy for the non-elite people who suffered and died in the arena, as opposed to his deep attentiveness to the psychological needs of the elite, who watched the torments with pleasure? But it is asking too much for any person, however philosophical, to rise above the culture of his or her own time. All right, this is when shit's starting to turn bad. The play could not go on forever. In 62 BCE, Burrus, who had shared with Seneca the task of advising the young emperor and trying to restrain his behavior, suddenly died. The story went out that he was poisoned by an unknown hand. Some said that the poison had been sent by Nero himself in the guise of medicine for a sore throat. Many, including the new head of the guard, were delighted to see him gone. Without the backing of Burrus and the Praetorian Guard, Seneca's position in Nero's court became very weak and very dangerous. It was time to try harder to get out. We turn now to the last years of Seneca's life, years in which the man himself felt he was living on borrowed time, practicing daily for death. It was in this period that Seneca produced some of his greatest prose work, including the Letters to Lucilius, which I believe is the book Letters from a Stoic, a series of highly literary but also highly engaging epistles to a slightly younger friend, dealing with many different aspects of philosophical life and natural questions. His most extensive discussion of natural scientific phenomena. Let me check my phone and make sure what the fuck. Okay. Okay, so the first time my phone has spoken to me. Boop boop doop boop. Stoicism was not the problem with Seneca from Nero's perspective. Rather, the old man had outstayed his welcome and had gone from being a useful aid in Nero's schemes to promote himself and his own pleasures against the obstacles of public opinion, to being a killjoy and an hindrance. Seneca's dilemma after the death of Burrus was how to extricate himself from the untenable position as minister to an emperor who no longer trusted him, and whose behavior was increasingly erratic, without arousing further suspicion or being killed. Seneca had been thinking about retirement for a long time. The dilemma was starker now, but it was by no means new. For many years, Seneca must have been wondering about his exit strategy. One way to avoid any suspicion that retirement meant treason was to adopt philosophy as a mask, and to suggest that any person might have purely psychological, not political reasons for wanting to be away from the rat race. In an essay on leisure, probably composed quite a long time before he actually withdrew from Nero's court, Seneca vividly evokes the benefits that come from retirement from public life, and in doing so also evokes the psychological and moral pressure involved in being in the public eye. He tells the addressee that only alone in retirement is it possible to maintain a consistent purpose in life. The problem with contemporary society is that it creates a life that is not only immoral, but worse, fickle. People constantly change their minds and their actions based on fashion and the influence of those around them. Only in retirement and in solitude can one stick consistently to whatever it is that one really wants to do with one's time. Interesting. Okay, let's read this big one. Seneca, who knew Horace's poetry well, transferred the problem into his own terms in the speeches he made to Nero in begging for retirement from the court. After Burrus died, more and more voices raised against Seneca to Nero. Gossips reported to the emperor that Seneca was greedily still increasing his private fortune and abrogating to himself honors that really belonged only to Nero, including literary honor as well as vast wealth. They presented Seneca as deliberately copying and challenging Nero's greatest accomplishments. For instance, they told him that Seneca was writing poetry more often now, that Nero had developed a love for it. And even worse, they reminded the emperor that Seneca was always scolding him about his most enjoyable activities, such as chariot racing and singing. Seneca's intellectual and cultural talents, which had once been an asset in Nero's court, had now become a liability. He was too productive, too clever, too talented. How long was nothing to be believed glorious at Rome unless it originated from Seneca? they asked. Nero was a man now, these critics reminded him. He could afford to cast off his tutor. Seneca was highly conscious of how hazardous his position now was. Tacitus gives us a wonderfully satirical account of Seneca's attempt at a strategic exit speech in 62, which is worth quoting at length. Seneca asked to speak to the emperor face to face, was admitted, and began by saying, this is Seneca to Nero, "It is now 14 years, Caesar, since I was joined to your hope, and 8 years since you became emperor. In the meantime, you have piled such honor and wealth upon me that nothing is lacking for my happiness, except moderation in its enjoyment." He cites the examples of others who had helped emperors, such as Agrippa, advisor in general to Augustus, and acknowledges how little in comparison he has been able to offer Nero. "What have I been able to offer to your generosity except my learning, which was trained, so to speak, in the shade, which has become famous only because people see me as having helped the early stages of your youth? A vast reward for such a thing. But you have given me an enormous influence, huge amounts of money, so much that I often ask myself, is this me? Am I, born from a simple equestrian, provincial background, counted among the most important people of the state? Among those noblemen of ancient families has my new name begun to shine?" At this stage of the speech, Seneca still seems to be treating Nero's bounty as more or less a good thing, despite being undeserved and unfitting for one of his station. But then he shifts to suggest that he's been morally corrupted by too much wealth. Where is that soul that was happy with moderation? Has it laid out such gardens, walked through such suburban mansions, grown fat on such vast acres of land, and such far-flung investments? I have just one defense to make. I had a duty not to stand in the way of your gifts. But now Seneca suggests that the emperor's generosity has extended far enough. We have both filled up the measure, both you of what a prince should give a friend, and I of what a friend should take from a prince. Anything more will increase envy. The only solution is for Nero to take it all back. I ask for help. I can no longer bear my riches. Order from my estates to be organized by your own procurators, to be taken back into your own wealth. I will not beat myself down to poverty, but I will give back the things whose splendor dazzles me, and the time I used to devote to gardens and villas, I will turn back to the soul. Told you he was a little bitch. And, if you're struggling and you don't have much money, I guess we should all consider ourselves happy and fortunate. This guy was begging for Nero to take back the riches. It was a fine effort, but Nero saw through it. His reply was brilliant and cruel. Nero declared, "If I am able to meet the practiced rhetoric of your speech right away, that is the first of my debts to you." At last, by this stage of his reign, Nero was able to give his own speech with no need of Seneca's help as a speechwriter. He went on to pretend that they were still friends, that he still genuinely felt grateful to Seneca, and that he did not realize how desperately Seneca wanted to be away from him. At the same time, he insisted that there was no possibility of going back on the arrangement. The first reason was that Seneca had given him such imperishable gifts that the small things Nero could give in return, a handful of villas, a few miles of parkland, some millions of coins, were nothing in comparison. It was, frankly, embarrassing to think how little he had managed to give his greatest benefactor. He had not even made him the richest man on earth. I blush that you, who are first in my love, are not yet excelling everyone in fortune. The second and more truthful reason Nero gave for refusing to let Seneca retire was that it would look bad for himself. not your moderation. If you give back your money, not your retirement. If you leave your prince, but my avarice and the fear of my cruelty will be on everyone's lips. Even if your abstinence is praised to the skies, it would not be fitting for a wise man to get glory from the bad reputation of his friend. So saying, he kissed Seneca, being used by nature and practice to veil his hatred under a show of affection. Seneca expressed his gratitude, as of course he had to do if he wanted to survive. But he then, Tacitus tells us, moved into a much more retired mode of life, while still being officially under the emperor's service. Without leaving the city, he banished callers and mostly stayed at home, reading, writing, and claiming to be too ill to go out. Illness was, again, a useful excuse to deal with an impossible social position. So Seneca knows that he's fucked. He's not leaving the house, saying that he's too sick. And then some plot pops up to overthrow Nero, which he wasn't exactly involved in, but he didn't, when he heard about it, he didn't panic and tell anybody. I don't know where. Seneca addresses the question of, all right, let's move this along. This leads to an extensive discussion of somebody called Hostius Quadra, a rich man obsessed with sex, who was eventually killed by his slaves in revenge for the degradations he had put them through. Hostius, Seneca tells us, enjoyed having group sex with both men and women, and also set up mirrors all around while he was in the act, which would exaggerate the size of his male partner's genitalia. He used mirrors to increase his corrupt desires, and failed to realize that nature gave us mirrors so that a human being can know himself. Hostius, in his obsession with watching himself, and especially with watching himself being penetrated, can be seen as the opposite of Seneca. In his idealized literary persona, Seneca maintains firm and vast boundaries around himself, making both body and soul impenetrable, and he looks for a mirror to reflect his own life, not in the luxurious mirrors created for the perversities of elite Roman life, but in the clouds and raindrops of the divine sky. In the Natural Questions, that's an essay that Seneca wrote, Seneca worked to turn his attention away from the anxieties of political human life toward the broader, vaster view of natural phenomena. He implies that his addressee, Lucilius, can escape not only from the evils of the external human world, but also from himself by releasing his mind to the study of the heavens, which is the ultimate form of liberation. This, we are told, unchains the mind, prepares it for the contemplation of heavenly things, and makes it worthy to associate with God. Having lost his colleague Burrus, and at least one other dear friend, Serenus, to death, Seneca builds up his friendship with another friend, Lucilius, the addressee of both Natural Questions and Letters to Lucilius. Little is known about Lucilius himself. Seneca is our only source for his life, and the letters do not give much substantial information about him. He was, we gather, of equestrian status, a native of southern Italy, a frequent visitor to Pompeii, slightly younger than Seneca himself, and working as a procurator, an imperial administrator, on Sicily. It is possible that he was the author of the poem on volcanoes, a subject that could have been easily studied by one living near Mount Etna, and whose author seems to have a strong knowledge of Seneca's Natural Questions. Lucilius is presented as setting out to make progress in philosophy, in search of advice from one who has progressed just a little further down the same road. He is, we learn, considering giving up his political life for philosophical retirement, a situation suspiciously like Seneca's own recent past. such that some commentators have suspected that Lucilius may be an imaginary friend. His name, again suspiciously, seems reminiscent of Seneca's own Lucilius, is a diminutive form of Lucius. Lucius is like Seneca's own smaller, younger self. Okay, so that's about... We're almost to the end of this book. Seneca goes on to insist that one should regard all losses, even the death of those we love most dearly, as simply the falling of leaves from a nourishing plant. Loved ones cannot grow again like leaves, but they can be replaced. Much though we may love his wife, or at least love her attentiveness to him, Seneca insists that the really important relationship is always with oneself. The things you run from are inside of you. Seneca acknowledges that being an old man without having achieved wisdom is an embarrassing position to be in. What is more undignified than an old man who is only just beginning to live? There is a real possibility that each day may be the last, either for Lucilius or for Seneca himself. If not from old age, then from Nero. But there is also a repeated acknowledgement that wisdom does not come at all at once, as if through a single moment of insight or inspiration. It is a product of practice, of daily, repeated, devoted habit. Wisdom, wow, that's what I'm trying to do. Be your own spectator. Praise yourself. That reminds me of the advice I always give young comedians, that you got to be your own best cornerman to build yourself up. The career up the Roman ladder of success is presented as a condition of permanent slavery, although not to a human master, but to one's own desires. Once one starts on the path of ambition, there is no end to more wants. From the end of one desire springs up another. Power and prosperity are, then, vehicles of enslavement. Take your worn-out neck from the yoke. Better to have it severed once and for all than be pressed down forever. The greatest proof of an evil mind is fluctuation and constant wavering between the pretense of virtue and the love of vice. Wow. Consumerism provides no psychological satisfaction because there is no limit to our desires for things that we never needed in the first place. Moreover, it is not only pointless but spiritually damaging. We acquire property that actually robs us of the power to know ourselves and live in accordance with nature, and we believe that losing it will be a real pain, a belief that is pure illusion. One who owns himself has lost nothing. Hunger for food is satisfied by enough food to fill the stomach, but hunger for something we don't actually need, like nice clothes or a big house or piles of gold, has no natural limit, because there is no natural need that these things satisfy. Natural desires are limited, but those that spring from false opinion can have no place to stop. Wow. Still beautiful, solid words for today. Money never makes one rich. Seneca shows his intense awareness that one's own good fortune can become a trap. Even people, he insists, are not essential to the core of happiness. You can lose your whole family, your spouse, children, friends, everyone you ever knew and loved, and still, if you are virtuous, you can be happy. Virtue takes hold of the whole soul and takes away any longing for anything. Okay. Yes. Okay, so now this is Seneca's death. The philosopher is concerned with creating an impression for a large audience, and for his admiring readers in years to come, rather than influencing the political future. Tacitus wryly remarks that his words about Nero seemed to be meant for the general public, even though he was supposedly addressing only a small group of friends. Similarly, even after he and Paulina was Seneca's wife, have slashed their wrists, Seneca manages to keep talking to the public. He called his secretaries and dictated a long speech, which has already been published in his own words, so I will hold back from summarizing it. Tacitus is quietly mocking Seneca's attempt to control the script of his own death, implying that there is something a little unseemly about this master of rhetoric making a public relations exercise even from his own dying hour. The vein slashing did not work for Seneca. Perhaps he had suspected that this method might not be successful when his time came. He wrote in his essay, The Natural Questions, that when veins are cut, the blood continues to ooze either until it all flows out or until the cut in the vein closes and shuts off the bleeding, or some other reason keeps the blood back. In his own case, the blood failed to flow out because his body was too old and skinny, emaciated from years of fasting. He cut behind his knees as well, but to no avail. Fearing that the sight of his suffering might upset his wife, and he himself might slip from his purpose at seeing her agonies, he sent her off to the bedroom, where the soldiers bandaged her arms and saved her life. It is telling that Seneca feared being distracted from his purpose by his wife's pain, a detail that marks the difference from Socrates' death scene as clearly as anything. Seneca was not blessed with perfect philosophical calm and resolution at all times. He had a constant struggle to abide by his moral purpose. That's basically sums up Seneca's entire life, not only his death scene. Seneca was not blessed with perfect philosophical calm and resolution at all times. He had a constant struggle to abide by his moral purpose. When even the legs would not bleed enough, Seneca again emulated Socrates by calling for hemlock. Hemlock is poison. His hemlock, however, was not administered by a public executioner, but by his own private doctor. He had bought it long ago, presumably at some expense, in readiness for a death he knew was likely to come in this forced manner. However, even the hemlock did not work on his cold, feeble body. He stepped into a dish of hot water, spattering the poor slaves standing nearby. This spill was, he said, a libation to Jupiter the Liberator. Finally, he had his slaves lift him into the hot bath, and he suffocated in the steam. They cremated him immediately, according to his wish. All right, Seneca's dead, and we got sirens going by. Although he describes him as failing to live by his true beliefs, he had freedom as a writer, but lacked it in life. The Stoics, including Seneca, claimed that the wise man can be entirely free from vice and can live in a state of total tranquility, undisturbed by false emotions. Okay, there's the Diderot thing. All right, so that's basically the life of Seneca. And I wanted to read, I don't think I'll have time to get to dialogues and letters, but I wanted to read you just anybody who knows me, whenever I read a book, I highlight it. And then if I really like a highlight, I will put a little star next to it. So let me just read you the stars from Letters from a Stoic. The duties it inculcated, courage and endurance, self-control and self-reliance, upright conduct, and just dealing, simple and unluxurious habits, rationality, obedience to the state. Well, I'm with you on everything but the last part. His tremendous faith in philosophy as a mistress was grounded on a belief that her end was the practical one of curing souls, of bringing peace and order to the feverish minds of men pursuing the wrong aims in life. What we say should be of use, not just entertaining. Amen, brother. Make your own Bible. Select and collect all the words and sentences that in all your reading have been to you like the blast of triumph out of Shakespeare, Seneca, Moses, John, and Paul. In fraternal good humor, advising him to be regular at his work, to keep a journal, to remember that life was short, to study Plato and Seneca, love his wife, and disregard the world's opinion. Well, this is just the introduction. Okay, here we are. This is the letters from a Stoic. Some men have shrunk so far into dark corners that objects in bright daylight seem quite blurred to them. I view with pleasure and approval the way you keep on at your studies and sacrifice everything to your single-minded efforts to make yourself every day a better man. I do not merely urge you to persevere in this. I actually implore you to. Let me give you, though, this one piece of advice. Refrain from following the example of those whose craving is for attention, not their own improvement, by doing certain things which are calculated to give rise to comment on your appearance or way of living generally. Avoid shabby attire, long hair, and unkempt beard, an outspoken dislike of silverware, sleeping on the ground, and all other misguided means of self-advertisement. The first thing philosophy promises us is the feeling of fellowship, of belonging to mankind, and being members of a community. Being different will mean the abandoning of that manifesto. Our motto, as everyone knows, is to live in conformity with nature. It is quite contrary to nature to torture one's body, to reject simple standards of cleanliness and make a point of being dirty, to adopt a diet that is not just plain, but hideous and revolting. I'll skip that part. You must inevitably either hate or imitate the world, but the right thing is to shun both courses. You should neither become like the bad because there are many, nor be an enemy of the many because they are unlike you. Retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach, and there is no reason why any pride in advertising your talents abroad should lure you forward into the public eye, inducing you to give readings of your works or deliver lectures. I should be glad to see you doing that if what you had to offer them was suitable for the crowd I have been talking about. But the fact is, not one of them is really capable of understanding you. You might perhaps come across one here and there, but even they would need to be trained and developed by you to a point where they could grasp your teaching. For whose benefit, then, did I learn it all? If it was for your own benefit that you learnt it, you have no call to fear that your trouble may have been wasted. Okay, that was long. Reflect that nothing merits admiration except the spirit, the impressiveness of which prevents it from being impressed by anything. To win true freedom, you must be a slave to philosophy. If you wish to be loved, love. Great pleasure is to be found not only in keeping up an old and established friendship, but also in the beginning and building up a new one. I have all of my valuables with me. There was an active and courageous man, victorious over the very victory of the enemy. I have lost, he said, nothing. He made Demetrius wonder whether he had won a victory at all. All my possessions, he said, are with me, meaning by this the qualities of a just and good and enlightened character, and indeed the very fact of not regarding as valuable anything that is capable of being taken away. We are impressed at the way some creatures pass right through fire without physical harm. How much more impressive is the way this man came through the burning and the bloodshed and the ruins uninjured and unscathed? Does it make you see how much easier it can be to conquer a whole people than to conquer a single man? Those words of Stilbo's are equally those of the Stoic. He too carries his valuables intact through cities burnt to ashes, for he is contented with himself. This is the line he draws as the boundary for his happiness. Not happy he who thinks himself not so. What difference does it make, after all, what your position in life is if you dislike it yourself? Everybody, I highly recommend Letters from a Stoic. I know we're burning. The life of folly is empty of gratitude, full of anxiety. It is focused wholly on the future. Who said that, you ask? The same man as before. And what sort of life do you think is meant by the life of folly? No, he means by... All right, let's skip that. It is clear to you, I know, Silius, that no one can lead a happy life, or even one that is bearable, without the pursuit of wisdom, and that the perfection of wisdom is what makes the happy life, although even the beginnings of wisdom make life bearable. All right, I'm starting to get tired. I got a flight to London. Whatever your destination, you will be followed by your failings. Here is what Socrates said to someone who was making the same complaint. How can you wonder your travels do you no good when you carry yourself around with you? You are saddled with the very thing that drove you away. How can novelty of surroundings abroad and becoming acquainted with foreign scenes or cities be of any help? All that dashing about turns out to be quite futile. And if you want to know why all this running away cannot help you, the answer is simply this. You are running away in your own company. You have to lay aside the load on your spirit. Until you do that, nowhere will satisfy you. Where you arrive does not matter so much as what sort of person you are when you arrive there. We ought not, therefore, to give over our hearts for good to any one part of the world. We should live with the conviction, I wasn't born for one particular corner. The whole world's my home country. Amen. If the truth of that were clear to you, you would not be surprised that the diversity of new surroundings, for which, out of weariness of the old, you are constantly heading, fails to do you any good. Whichever you first came to would have satisfied you if you had believed you were at home in all. As it is, instead of traveling, you are rambling and drifting, exchanging one place for another when the thing you are looking for, the good life, is available everywhere. Amen. The men who pioneered the old routes are leaders, not our masters. Truth lies open to everyone. There has yet to be a monopoly of truth, and there is plenty of it left for future generations, too. But the essence of the advice I'd like to give is this. Treat your inferiors in the way in which you would like to be treated by your own superiors. And whenever it strikes you how much power you have over your slave, let it also strike you that your own master has as much power over you. As things are, isn't it the height of folly to learn inessential things when time's so desperately short? Why does no one admit to his failings? Because he's still deep in them. It's the person who is awakened who recounts his dream, and acknowledging one's failings is a sign of health. So let us rouse ourselves so that we may be able to demonstrate our errors. But only philosophy will wake us. Only philosophy will shake us out of that heavy sleep. Devote yourself entirely to her. You're worthy of her. She's worthy of you. Fall into each other's arms. Say a firm, plain no to every other occupation. There's no excuse for your pursuing philosophy merely in moments when occasion allows. If you were sick and you would take a rest of attending to your personal affairs and drop your practice in the courts, and during a spell of improvement in your condition, you wouldn't look on any client as being so important that you'd undertake his case in court. No, you'd devote your entire attention to recovering from your illness in the quickest possible time. Well then, aren't you going to do the same in these circumstances? Away with every obstacle and leave yourself free to acquire a sound mind. No one ever attains this if he's busy with other things. Philosophy wields an authority over her own. She doesn't just accept time, she grants one it. She's not something one takes up in odd moments. She's an active, full-time mistress, ever present and demanding. Give your whole mind to her. Sit at her side and pay her constant court, and an enormous gap will widen between yourself and other men. You'll end up far in advance of all mankind, and not far behind the gods themselves. All right, that was pretty sweet. All right, let me just read you a couple more stars, and then we'll wrap this up. As it is with play, so it is with life. What matters is not how long the acting lasts, but how good it is. It is not important at what point you stop. Stop wherever you will. Only make sure that you round it off with a good ending. That's what Mr. Martin used to always tell me. Every story should have a good ending. A man is unhappy as he has convinced himself he is. So stop complaining and bitching and shit. There may be pleasure in the memory of even these events. Look at the amount of punishment that boxers and wrestlers take to the face and the body generally. They will put up nonetheless with any suffering in their desire for fame, and will undergo it all not merely in the course of fighting, but in preparing for their fights as well. Their training in itself constitutes suffering. Let us too overcome all things, with our reward consisting not in any wealth, not in any wreath or garland, not in trumpet calls for silence, for the ceremonial proclamation of our name, but in moral worth, in strength of spirit, in a peace that is won forever once in any contest fortune has been utterly defeated. As Poseidonus said, in a single day there lies open to men of learning more than there ever does to the unenlightened in the longest of lifetimes. In the meantime, cling tooth and nail to the following rule: not to give in to adversity, never to trust prosperity, and always take full note of fortune's habit of behaving just as she pleases, treating her as if she were actually going to do anything it is in her power to do. Whatever you have been expecting for some time comes as less of a shock. Tell them of all the things men do that they would blush at sober, and that drunkenness is nothing but a state of self-induced insanity. Drunkenness inflames and lays bare every vice, removing the reserve that acts as a check on impulses to wrong behavior. What else was it but drinking to excess, together with a passion for Cleopatra, itself is a potent drink, that ruined that great and gifted man Mark Antony, dragging him down into foreign ways of living and un-Roman vices. Okay. Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen. And the man who is master of himself, the master of all. Surely it was a joy to roam the earth with marvels scattered so widely around one. Okay, here we go. But though they all possessed a character more robust than that of today, and one with a greater aptitude for hard work, it is equally true that their personalities fell short of genuine perfection. For nature does not give a man virtue. The process of becoming a good man is an art. Certainly, they did not go in search of gold or silver or the various crystalline stones to be found in the nethermost dregs of the earth. They were still merciful even to dumb animals. Man was far and away from killing man, not out of fear or provocation, but simply for entertainment. They had yet to wear embroidered clothing, and had yet to have gold woven into robes, or even mine it. But the fact remains that the innocence was due to ignorance and nothing else. And there is a world of indifference, and there is a world of difference between, on the one hand, choosing not to do what is wrong, and on the other, not knowing what to do in the first place. They lacked the cardinal virtues of justice, moral insight, self-control, and courage. They were corresponding qualities. In each case, not unlike these, they had a place in their primitive lives. But virtue only comes to a character which has been thoroughly schooled and trained and brought to a pitch of perfection by unremitting practice. We are born for it, but not with it. And even in the best of people, until you cultivate it, there is only the material for virtue, not virtue itself. One thing I know, all the works of mortal man lie under sentence of mortality. We live among things that are destined to perish, which it may be has only been consumed so as to be called higher things. A setback has often cleared the way for greater prosperity. Many things have fallen only to rise to more exalted heights. Okay. What you must do then is mend your ways and get rid of your burden you're carrying. Keep your cravings within safe limits. Scour every trace of evil from your personality. If you want to enjoy your travel, you must make your traveling companion a healthy one. Well, that's nice. The final blow was his conviction and sentence on the most serious of charges. He was accused of blasphemy and corrupting the younger generation at Socrates. It was alleged he turned into rebels against God, their fathers, and the state. After that came the prison and the poison. And so little effect did all this have on Socrates' spirit, it did not even affect the expression on his face. What a rare and wonderful story of achievement. To the very last, no one ever saw Socrates in any particular mood of gaiety or depression. Through all the ups and downs of his fortune, his was a level temperament. One has to accept life on the same terms as the public baths, or crowds, or travel. Things will get thrown at you and things will hit you. Life's no soft affair. It's a long road you've started on. You can't but expect to have slips and knocks and falls, and get tired and openly wish a lie for death. At one place, you will part from your companion. At another, bury one, and be afraid of one at another. These are the kind of things you'll come up against all along this rugged journey. Wanting to die, let the personality be made ready to face everything. Let it be made to realize that it has come to terrain on which thunder and lightning play. Oh my God, I needed that drink of water. The listener is told at very considerable length that men should look on riches as consisting in the spirit and not in the inherited estates, and that a man is wealthy if he has attuned himself to his restricted means and has made himself rich on little. But verses such as the following he finds a good deal more striking. He needs but little who desires but little. He has his wish, whose wish can be to have what is enough. All right. Every day as it comes should be welcomed and reduced forthwith into our own possession as if it were the finest day imaginable. What flies past has to be seized at. Above whose head the mighty gates of heaven thunder. People's speech matches their lives. The spirit and the intellect cannot be of different hues. If the spirit is sound, if it is properly adjusted and has dignity and self-control, the intellect will be sober and sensible too. And if the former is tainted, the latter will be infected as well. Okay, here we go. This is the end. See then that the spirit is well looked after. Our thoughts and our words proceed from them. We derive our demeanor and our expression in the very way we walk from it. If the spirit is sound and healthy, our style will be firm and forceful and virile. But if the spirit tumbles, all the rest of our personality comes down in ruins with it. The queen unharmed, the bees all live at one. Once she is lost, the hive's in anarchy. The spirit is our queen. So long as she is unharmed, the rest remains at its post, obedient and submissive. If she wavers for a moment, in the same moment, the rest all falters. Until we have begun to go without them, we fail to realize how unnecessary many things are. Okay, this is the last page. No man's good by accident. Virtue has to be learnt. Pleasure is a poor and petty thing. No value should be set on it. It's something we share with dumb animals. The minutest, most insignificant creatures scuttle after it. Glory is an empty, changeable thing, as fickle as the weather. Poverty's no evil to anyone unless he kicks against it. Death is not an evil. What is it then? The one law mankind has that is free of all discrimination. Superstition is an idiotic heresy. It fears those who should love it. It dishonors those it worships. For what difference does it make whether you deny the gods or bring them into disrepute? These are things which should be learnt, and not just learnt, but learnt by heart. Philosophy has no business to supply vice with excuses. A sick man who is encouraged to live in a reckless manner by his doctor has not a hope of getting well. All right. Well, that's it. I don't have time to read dialogues and letters. It's getting late. It's 10 p.m. I have a flight at noon to London. Haven't been to England in 5 years. I'm really excited to play in all these beautiful theaters and to hang out with my friend, who I love very much, in his philosophical brain. I will get to experience the British Isles, opening for Reginald D. Hunter on his Facing the Beast UK theater tour. And so read Seneca if you want to be happy. And I would say start with Letters from a Stoic. And praise little bitches and pussies. That's what I'm talking about. And long may you run, my people. And nurture your spirits. Nurture your wealth that is only your spirit and your heart and the way you operate in the world. And shalom, amigos, amigas, and long may each and every one of you run. Hooray for humanity.
Tom Rhodes, you're a funny man. Tom Rhodes, you're an international comedian. Tom Rhodes, karate kick, baby, oh yeah. Tom Rhodes, you're a groovy dude. You go all around the world, telling jokes to all of the people. You are an international comedian. You're funny to everybody in every single country in the world. Tom Rhodes, I like you very much. I think you're talented and very wonderful. Tom Rhodes, you're the best guy in the world. I wanna be your friend, you should call me sometime. Here is my phone number, 603-644-0048. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tom Rhodes, you're an international comedic sensation. Tom Rhodes, I like to listen to your podcast. Tom Rhodes, you're the best man to ever walk on the earth.